Imagine walking into the town you grew up only to find that everything you once knew was now different.
Your old house is gone, the street names have changed, but how? You know you didn't take a wrong turn.
Here are 10 creepy stories of people who claimed to visit another reality.
This first story comes from Reddit user Glitch in the Matrix, and it's pretty long, so I'm gonna have to paraphrase. The user starts off by setting the scene. They are around 18 or 19 years old, living in their childhood home. One day, they decide to go for a walk to a nearby park, which they had been doing since they were young. It was around 1 or 2 p.m. They stepped out of the front door, and all of a sudden, things just felt wrong. Everything felt different. It didn't look different, but it felt different and completely wrong. They decided to shake it off and continued their walk down to the park when they locked eyes with their neighbor, whose face went completely pale as though he had seen a ghost. Just as the neighbor was about to speak, user Glitch in the Matrix found themselves back in their house, standing at the front door, ready to leave for their walk. They stood there for a few moments in complete disbelief, but at the same time relieved, because things didn't feel different or wrong anymore. They looked down the street and the neighbor was nowhere to be found. Regardless, they decided to skip the walk for that day. The entire experience, the teleportation, and the incredibly off feeling of the neighborhood had left the user quite uneasy, even now, so many years later. Not only that, it has left them wondering if somehow momentarily they slipped into some kind of alternate reality, only to be brought back to where they truly belong just moments later. Spooky.
In March of 2006, Carol Chase McKinley was driving with her dog from San Bernardino to Paris, California. She decided to make a pit stop in Riverside, where she grew up. She had grandparents buried in a local cemetery and remembered her own time living there. Once she got there, she was shocked to find that familiar places, including her family's old homes and the cemetery, were completely unrecognizable. The cemetery was overgrown and unkempt, and the houses she remembered had been replaced by newer buildings. Even Riverside City College and Central Middle School, which she recognized, seemed oddly out of place compared to her memories. Her old neighborhood, which had once featured her grandmother's large Tudor home and her aunt's house, was now a rundown area with modern bungalows and graffiti. The banks, insurance companies, and restaurants she remembered were gone. She felt so unsettled by the changes and the ominous atmosphere that she was afraid to even stop and ask for directions. Eventually, she returned to Paris, where everything was normal. But here's the strange thing. When she went back to Riverside a few years later for her father's funeral, everything had reverted back to how she remembered it from her childhood. Her family's homes were as they had been. Everything felt right again. Now your first thought is like, well, alright, she just took a wrong turn and wasn't actually in her hometown before. But as I said, certain landmarks had been correct. Like the college and the middle school. The cemetery was also in the same spot. It was just run down. It was as if she'd driven into some strange upside down version of her childhood town.
Alright, this next story comes from Reddit user Deathstar_57, and it was actually posted to the unofficial Most Amazing Top 10 Reddit page, which we do not run, but it does have some pretty interesting stories and some pretty creepy ones too. My advice: don't read them before bed. Anyways, the story goes as follows. I got up and found my pet dead on the ground, so I buried him outside my house. But when I woke up the next morning, my pet was still dead on the ground. So I went to the spot it was first buried, and its body was still there. A few months later, I slipped off my bike and hit my head, and I was in a coma. I remember feeling movement, but I couldn't open my eyes. When I woke up, I was taken home, and after a few days, I found my dog alive outside of my yard. Now, while this entire thing could have very well likely been a coma dream, it's also entirely possible that while unconscious, this guy slipped into 1 or even 2 alternate realities in which his beloved pet didn't make it. But I'm glad that in this reality at least, Deathstar57's dog is alive and well.
In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia posted on an internet forum about all these strange things that had suddenly changed in her life, as if she'd suddenly shifted into another reality. The story got a decent amount of buzz at the time. According to Garcia, who was 41 at the time, she'd woken up on what seemed like an average morning, but surprise, she'd switched realities. For starters, her pajamas and bed sheets were different than they were when she went to bed. This was odd, but nothing to panic about, so she headed off to work. When she got there though, it became clear that something was definitely off. When she got to her floor, she quickly realized she was in the wrong department. even though she'd gone to the exact location and floor she'd been going to for 20 years. She went back home only to find that her new boyfriend wasn't there either. Instead, it was the dude she'd broken up with 6 months before. She asked him what the hell he was doing in her house, and he looked at her like she was crazy. She tried calling her new boyfriend, nothing. Tried going to his house, someone else was living there. She even went as far as to hire a private detective to find him, but nothing ever turned up. So did Lorena Garcia just have a really detailed, vivid dream about some other man that never really existed, or did she happen to take a fateful fall into the Twilight Zone?
In 1947, in Tokyo's Haneda Airport, a man named John Zergus handed his passport over to the gate agent. Only thing was, his passport had been issued in a country, Torrid, that as far as we know, doesn't exist. The gate agent looked at the man, who was well dressed and calm and appeared completely normal, save his incredibly strange identification document, and questioned him about the legitimacy of the passport. John then became irritated, insisting that Torrid did in fact exist and that it was located between Spain and France. The more they questioned him, the more frustrated he became, and he even pulled out his driver's license and bank statements, all of which had been issued in this unknown Torrid place. Eventually, police stepped in, and John Zergus was taken to a hotel to be held overnight until he could be properly investigated the following morning. The hotel room John stayed in was on a high floor with no balcony, and it was guarded the entire duration of his stay, which is why officials were so incredibly baffled when they opened the door to his bedroom the next morning to find absolutely no sign of John or any of his belongings. No one could figure out how or where he'd gone. While this might sound like some kind of urban legend or old wives' tale, the case of John Zergus, who was detained in Japan for identity fraud, is a documented case in Japanese history. Whether or not the whole Torrid thing is true is up for debate, but if it is true, it certainly points to a significant glitch in reality where John was momentarily detained in our version of reality before returning, hopefully safely, to his own.
This next story is absolutely wild. Not only do we have people ending up in a place they don't recognize, seemingly out of nowhere, but you have strange futuristic vehicles, a police investigation, and the case is from 1972, long before the internet and the popularity of all these reality shifting stories on internet forums. In May of 1972, 4 girls were driving back to Southern Utah University after spending a Saturday at a rodeo. At around 10 p.m. they crossed into the Utah-Nevada state line and took a turn into Gadianton Canyon. Strangely, as they drove, the road began to change from black pavement to white cement. Thinking they were lost, they turned around but found themselves driving past unfamiliar grain fields and Ponderosa pines instead of the desert that they'd been expecting. They stopped at a roadside tavern to ask for directions, but suddenly one of the girls started screaming. What they claimed to have seen were 4 egg-shaped vehicles with tricycle wheels and bright lights chasing them. Terrified, they hopped back into the car and sped through the canyon, and soon the road returned to the familiar black asphalt. They ended up crashing into a creek, which left them with 3 flat tires. They waited until morning and then hiked to Highway 56, where they flagged down a state trooper named Victoria Lindquist. The trooper took their report, and some details about the situation were pretty odd. The tire tracks the girls left stopped abruptly about 600 feet into the desert, which was strange considering they were found 2 miles away from the highway with no clear evidence of how they got there. And despite a thorough search, there was a missing right front hubcap of their Chevy that was never found.
Asturo Boone, the legend of the red and white-haired woman who lived aboard the hollow ship, is an incredibly old Japanese tale that tells of a futuristic ship made of metal and wood, equipped with crystal windows that one day made its way into the shores of Hitachi, a province in Japan. From the ship emerged an incredibly futuristic-looking woman with bright red hair with long white strands at the bottom and pale grayish skin. She appeared shocked to have ended up in the area and was downright terrified of the locals. She didn't speak any known languages, and she refused to let go of a small box she held tightly to her chest throughout the entire ordeal. Authorities entered her ship to find nothing more than 2 sheets, a small supply of water, and some strange food that resembled some kind of pastry made of meat and bread. Eventually, the woman was allowed back on the ship and sent on her way. Where she came from, or where she went, no one really knows. Perhaps she traveled to Japan from the future, or maybe even an alternate reality. And while I respect the locals' respect respecting the woman's privacy at the time, I am curious as to what they would have found had they looked in the box she had been holding onto so tightly. Since the incident, many people have claimed to have seen the woman from another world, but we are yet to learn her true origin, what was in the box, and why on earth she was so scared.
In 1975, a man named Daniel Brinkley was struck by lightning while answering the phone. He was declared dead for 28 minutes before being revived. During those minutes, Brinkley claimed to experience what he described as leaving his body, finding himself in a dark, terrifying realm. He was then rescued by spiritual beings who took him through a tunnel of light. He claims he met beings of light who showed him his life's events in a kind of life review, seeing every moment of his life and how his actions had affected others, kind of like a more modern version of A Christmas Carol. The experience changed him profoundly, and he came back with this mission to share his story and the lessons he learned about life after death. He wrote a book about the experience that was successful enough to spawn a couple sequels and a movie in 1995.
The story of William Cantello and Hiram Maxim is either a case of a man on the run or some kind of alternate reality Freaky Friday. You see, back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Cantello. He was an eccentric inventor who had dedicated a great amount of his time developing an automatic rapid-firing weapon. When he finally completed his invention, Cantello informed his son that he was heading down to the market to sell it. Only problem is, Cantello never returned. Even stranger, no more than 20 years later, a man named Hiram Maxim appeared on the scene. Maxim had invented an automatic rapid-firing weapon, and he looked almost identical to Cantello, so much so that Cantello's children actually mistook Maxim for their father. Maxim became so distraught with constantly being compared to Cantello that he later wrote about the experience in his autobiography, claiming that there was a man impersonating him. While that might be true, or perhaps Maxim really was Cantello and had simply wanted to get away from his family or out of some debt, there is another theory out there that Cantello and Maxim are essentially the same people but from different realities, and one day they switched, causing both to spend the rest of their days often mistaken for one another and incredibly confused and irritated.
This final story comes to us from a now deleted Reddit user that goes as follows. I had something really odd happen to me last Friday, and I'm wondering if anyone else has experienced something similar. I was running errands in my town, a place I know well. Around 3 p.m. I went to a coffee shop I frequent. When I walked in, I noticed that the decor was completely different, and the staff seemed unfamiliar. The menu had changed too, with items I've never seen before. I thought maybe I was in the wrong place, but the sign outside said it was definitely the same shop. I left feeling confused and decided to drive to a nearby park. When I got there, it was totally different. New playground equipment, a different layout, and even a new entrance. After about 2 hours of wandering around, everything suddenly felt familiar again. The coffee shop was back to normal, and the park was as I remembered. I haven't been able to find any explanation for this. Could I have briefly shifted into a different reality, or is there a more logical explanation? They later went on to make a brief update on the post, by the way, stating that they'd checked with the coffee shop and park management, and that apparently no changes had been made. Well, with that said, we'll catch you, yes you specifically, in whatever reality you wake up in tomorrow.
Sure, James could have purple hair.